I've titled this Innovation and Beyond Sustainability. And I'm going to talk about, I think, a great innovation that is actually happening in the moment with the effect, what for, in order to start thinking about that it's possible to just to regenerate rather than just sustain. So here's the plan for what I'm going to do, and it's a planned flow, and since I've written this up, the flow has changed, so that's typical. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the current reality of nature-dependent enterprises, and that will include, and then develop or introduce a generic theory of constraints management model based on 3 leverage points and what I call essential flow. And one of the applications of this model, the model is firstly developed around mining, and I will share a short case study on that, and then talk about another nature-dependent enterprise, which is farming, which is an industry which the whole world depends on. It is the foundational industry of everything. And start off by just talking about the conventional management model, and talk about the regenerative management model. And instead of a case study, I am going to share some results that's been achieved by regenerative farmers, and then have a short discussion on, is there a role for us as TOC implementers in this practice, or this, I think it is a TOC world, regenerative farming. Good, so the current reality is that these systems are managed with local optima, like many other systems. And it's about meeting local targets, it's about maximizing yields, it's about minimizing costs per ton, it's about OEEs, operational efficiencies of equipment, and it's about precisions, more than one type of precision that is being strived for. And the other reality of this type of enterprises is that the product price for what's being produced by these enterprises fluctuate based on supply and demand cycles. And they are commodities, these products, and very often the prices are controlled by governments, and very often the governments are subsidizing in order to assist with the problems around the cycles of supply and demand. The other current reality of these enterprises is that the production process damages the natural environment. So it's nature-dependent enterprises busy damaging the natural environment. There's effluent and waste, there's landscape destruction. Every mine goes from a hill to a hole. And there's always some destruction when I'm extracting, when I'm mining. And there's, in farming, erosion and desertification. The Fertile Crescent that we talked about 10,000 years ago is now desert. The Middle East, that's where the Fertile Crescent used to be. And the effect, one of the effects that we have is that we have carbon release to the atmosphere. And the result of that is that carbon stocks is unbalanced. The whole world has got just one, it is contained. There's only so much carbon in this whole system. But the stocks are unbalanced. We have an atmospheric surplus, and that has got lots of ramifications, and there's a terrestrial shortage. Management of these enterprises strives for economies of scale because the enterprises are marginal. The profit margin is very small, and therefore maximizing volume is the primary focus. And one of the things that exist in this current reality is that common sense is uncommon. So I'm first of all going to look at one nature-dependent enterprise called minerals extraction. And the flow is typically, there's been deposits over millennia of minerals. Then we mine it where we think we can find it. And then we process that with what we've mined, and then it's distributed in some way. So that's roughly, broad terms, the flow. So we developed as part of a mineral resource throughput management master's program at the University of the Free State in South Africa, what we call a generic TOC mining management model. Now this master's program, the students on that program are mostly geologists. It is in the Department of Geology at the university. And so geologists are learning this. But the model looks something like this. We've got a mineral resource. There's a mineral somewhere that's of value. And there's a market out there. And for all practical purposes, the market is infinite from a perspective of an enterprise. There's much more market out there than any one enterprise, any one mine can satisfy. But the resource is finite. It's only so much. And this is the system constraint. The resource is finite. You know, that's why we talk in mines of a life of mine. At some stage, the mine is going to stop. There's a death of the mine as well. It's the life of mine. Although, you know, when I started going to mines 30 years ago, there's one particular mine told me their life of mine is 30 years. And when I went there recently, they told me it's 30 years. That's the life of mine. So there's lots of technology. There's new deposits being found. There's new exploration technologies. And this, but still it's finite. It's going to run out at some stage. And there's a process, a flow, from taking this resource and turn it into a product where there's a demand for in the market. So mining, processing, distribution in broad terms, and typically, and there always is a capacity-constrained resource. Now, I define a capacity-constrained resource as the one thing that determines the capacity of the entire system, and I think Umberto's got a bit of a different definition when he talked about that. But if I can now, and typically it's processing, because processing is where there's the most capital-intensive part of the system, and that's why processing is very often the capacity-constrained resource. So if I have a good capacity profile, like that, which is typical, and I make sure that I don't have blockage and I don't have starvation, then that capacity-constrained resource determines the volume that this system can produce. It's the volume that this system can produce reliably. Because I've got a capacity profile in place, and I've got, I don't have starvation and blockage, then I can get reliability. And this is the volume that this system can deliver to the market. So that's the other part of the system, the other constraint. But I think there's a third one that we need to consider, and I call it the demand bottleneck. It says this is the demand that I can supply reliably, or perhaps I could say this is the demand that I want to supply reliably. Because there's some demand that I say no to, there's some demand, and this is the demand I want to say yes to. And it's a bottleneck because there's more demand out there than I can supply. So the mineral resource throughput management model says, but if I look at the finite or the systems constraint, it is not homogeneous. There's lots of variability or variation within this resource. And part of what we're saying is, but let's understand what are the different parts, how different is this resource, and define the differences between that and start using that as the basis of a buffer system, so we can supply to, if there is a end product buffers, I can supply from this buffer to a pull from a downstream buffer. Now, in many mines, a end product buffer doesn't exist, because if I talk about gold mining, nobody keeps a buffer of, there's a big buffer of gold, but I produce as much as I can and I sell that, and everybody is buy. I don't buy, there's no pool there, I just push. If I talk about diamond mining, also just push. But it's about the volume that I can produce. So, but recognizing that the resource is the system constraint, and in line of what Justin just said, if I want to maximize throughput per constrained unit, we're talking about here of maximizing throughput per ton mined. Because in this whole process, I mine somewhere, and I mine mineral and non-mineral. I can't mine just mineral. And therefore, that's why the process is necessary. So, but this whole system the improvement focus is what must be done by every part in the system in order to maximize throughput per ton mined, as in this case, the concept of throughput per constraint unit. So, making that more practical perhaps, from the reserve, the rock, there's a process of defining the mineral resource. What is it in the rock? Then to mine the mineral and non-mineral, and then recover the mineral and to have a product that goes into the market. So, what are the decisions that I've got to take to exploit if I want to maximize the throughput per ton mined? And taking into account these three constraints, or these three leverage points, and starting from the end, what I would like to, if I want to maximize throughput per ton mined, is look for the best quality for the customer, selling it to the best, or the customers will give me the best prices, but I must sell all the volume that I can. I must sell full volume. And for that, I need effective recovery at my processing plant, typically the capacity constrained resource, and maximize utilization there, taking into account I need protective capacity as well. And that means for the mineral resource that I have to find a way to mine the right places at the right time. Well, mine the right places. And it means activating the right mineral flow, and then the rest of the system, the subordination there is about have good mineral flow. Not just good flow, but good mineral flow. And good also mean stable, as Sanjeev said, and he talked about the coal mining was involved in. Stability is very important in this flow in order to have good mineral flow and to maximize the volume. So the planning process then is, it's a design, because it's not discrete flow we're talking about here. I'm designing, I size end product buffers if it's necessary. I size the end product buffers, and I then design the capacity constraint buffers, the process buffers. It's not a matter of sizing them. I've got to design them, decide how many do I have and what should be in each one of them. And that then goes to designing the resource buffers. And execution is about, if there's customer buffers, replenish that, replenish end product buffers and then replenish CCR buffers from the mineral resource. Expedite on red, like we all know we do in TOC, and focus improvements on reasons for red. Now this is a case study, a gold mine somewhere in Africa. They allowed me to say something about it, but not tell them exactly who they are. They decide typically on a monthly basis what's the desired grade for the mill, which in their case is the capacity constrained resource. And they replenish mining replenish to 10 different grade buffers. They monitor these buffers daily, and then they decide what to blend to reach a desired grade based on the buffer status every week. The current problem that students are working on at the moment is how to ensure the integrity of the buffers, making sure that the stockpile or the amount of rock lying there is actually what we think it's lying there. So in terms of quality and quantity. So these are some of the challenges that they have. So let's look at another nature-dependent enterprise and flow. Farm production. And this is somewhat different in the sense I have a seasonal, an annual growth season. And then there's a harvest, and then there's some processing taking place, or very little sometimes, and then distribute, and then there's processing after that. So this is the flow. And conventional farming management model also has a market that's infinite from an enterprise perspective. There's the demand for every farm's product is much more than the farm can produce. There's a process, the growth, the seasonal growth, processing, distribution, and conventional farming management model says, let's do a monocrop, a single crop, and we use land size is the system constraint. How much land I have determines how much, this is really the system's constraint. And then the protection that's built into the system is a protection through insurance and subsidies. The pipe that's possible from this capacity constraint resource changes every month or every season. I don't know exactly how much you're going to be able to produce every season. There's too many variables that changes that. But I want to fill the pipe as much as I can for that season, and then I sell this at the market price. That's a conventional model, and the result is that I have a very marginal operation, a marginal enterprise, and the focus is on maximizing yield, kilogram per hectare. And because the margin is so small, economies of scale is the way it works. Farms becoming bigger, it become more corporatized. It is just volume is the game. So in this environment, the current farming improvements are more inputs are necessary for more output per land unit. Now there's a guy an Australian called Walter Jenny that calls these farmers the moron farmers. And they're going to more and more new technology to farm more precisely. Precision farming with new technology. They determine the fertilizer, the herbicide, the pesticide needs very precisely, and then the technology are used to apply these needs accurately. And they're moving more and more to equipment automation. You're reducing the labor component, and you have, at this stage, self-driving harvesters and self-driving tractors. And so they are pretty advanced in terms of the self-driving technology. So you don't have to drive your tractor anymore. Just give it the coordinates, and then it does everything itself. When you talk about meat, cattle, it's about more efficient feedlots with more customized feeds in order to get more weight, more mass per animal. And the focus is minimizing cost per unit and maximizing yield. Now this kind of sounds like what we know to be the cost world. This sounds like a cost world. And when I started to look at this, I think, is it possible to improve this situation? I've found something called regenerative farming, which sounds much, much more like the throughput world. And exactly the same system. I still have the same markets, I've got the same process, but here land size is seen as the capacity constraint resource and not as the systems constraint. The land size will determine how much volume I can produce. What's the size of the pipe? And typically there is a capacity profile like that is in place in these systems. And the protection mechanism that is employed in this world is through increased diversity. There's no buffering, you can't buffer. There's increased diversity becomes the means for protection. And a buffer in the terms of a drought reserve, and the capacity profiles are typically in place. So this is what it typically looks like on these farms. There's a cornfield where you don't only see corn, you see corn and lots of other plants as well that is actually growing together with the corn. This is my favorite photograph of a farm in the very arid part of South Africa, the Kalahari. And in the front, in the foreground, there's the road reserve. There were never animals on it. On the left is where the animals has been recently, and the right is where the animals was last year, where the growth is just dramatically better than every year. So we're kind of starting to think about this resource is not finite. And the systems constraint is the health of the soil. And nobody has really defined what is the healthiest soil that exists. Yeah, so it's an infinite. It can, if you manage it right, be an infinite resource. The demand bottleneck, in this case, is consumer demand that can be satisfied reliably. Consumer demand, not just the market, but how can I get to the consumer, or how can I capture some consumers in order for my farm that I supply directly, which will give me a better price so that I can get more of my throughput per constrained unit metric, which is maximizing throughput per hectare. And perhaps I should add to this, per 100 millimeter of rain. Because that's also a limitation that I have to take into account. How much water did I have? And if I use water that I have to pump out of a river, it just increases my cost to the extent that my throughput goes down. So this model, this TOC world model, if you want to allow me to say this, is reducing the input costs dramatically, because there's no need for it becomes a biological farming rather than a chemical farming process. And these are the principles which is being applied in this environment. Don't plow. Minimize soil disturbance. And these are principles that have been developed over quite a number of years. And okay, there's broad agreement that these are the principles which is valid. Minimize soil disturbance, because what really determines the health of the soil, which is the systems constraint, are the microbial life in the soil. The things that lives there. Keep the soil covered, keep it cool. Provide it an armor to protect the microbial life that determines the soil health, the systems constraint. Increase the biodiversity as many fronts as possible, above ground and below ground, in terms of the plants is growing, in terms of the animals is using, in terms of on as many fronts as possible. This is all about exploiting the systems constraint. Keep living roots in the soil, because without roots, the microbial life can't be fed and they'll die. And use livestock to stimulate growth of plant growth. And the sixth principle that's been added quite recently is that every farm is different. So adapt to each unique context what has to happen. So this is the flow that actually happens in soil. Just a quick overview. Plants grow and photosynthesize. They produce root exudates, which are simple sugars, cakes and cookies. They're feeding the microorganisms. The microorganisms produces enzymes, and the enzymes pull nutrients from clays and salts and organic matter in the rocks, and then they die. And that's what fixes the carbon, is the dead microorganisms. And the more I do that, the better plants grow, and the better and the more photosynthesis I have. And improving this flow very often is done by planned grazing, the right time and the right amount, and animal impact. This is one of the great breakthroughs that was achieved or realized the last 30 years, by a guy called Alan Savory, is that there's a symbiotic relationship between animals and plants. And if animals utilize the plants very intensely for a short period of time, and then they don't come there anymore, like the massive herds that was roaming South Africa in the past, and they're still roaming Serengeti and the south of Sudan at this stage, then it stimulates the growth and it feeds. This whole process is improved. And if I can exploit it during the growing season of the plants, I can possibly get more out of it, because I take away and it can still grow, and then within the same season. So I get more root exudates, I get more microorganisms, produce more enzymes, I have more nutrients, and I get a better process. So there's the virtuous cycle of the flow is improved through the introduction of plant grazing as one of the tools of doing this. So here's the virtuous cycle. Crop production, livestock incorporation leads to less bare soil, more plant growth, more microbial life, more carbohydrates. And what happens is there's a soil carbon sponge that's created through this way of farming. And this is one of the terms that Walter Jenny has coined. And the density is 1.2. The soil density is 1.2 versus 2.6 to 3.5 of normal farming soil, which means there's lots more space for water. So 1 gram carbon, they say, is about equivalent to 8 grams of water. And the result is there's a better water cycle. The soil can hold more water. It doesn't flow away. It doesn't go into dams. It stays in the soil. There's a better mineral cycle. There's more community dynamics. There's better energy flow. And that's the virtuous cycle. And then the farmer comes in, and the farmer farms in such a way that you constantly look at what is happening with these cycles, and then make adjustments on what should I plant next? What should I rotate to next? How do I keep my soil covered more and more? There's a potential to deal with the problem that there's too much atmospheric carbon by drawing down, some estimates, 20 billion tons per annum of carbon that can be drawn down and sequestrated into soil. Practically, from a TOC perspective, what does this mean? The flow is a nutrient flow that we actually talk about here, not a product flow, a nutrient flow. And it comes from water and soil minerals that during the growing season get seeds to germinate. And sometimes I don't even have to plant the seeds because the seeds are there in any case. Or they're there from last season. The plants grow and photosynthesize. Crop is harvested or is consumed by plants. And the decisions then to exploit are maximize microbial life and diversity, get effective growth, make sure that growing is happening when the season is good for growing, it can grow effectively. And when you deal with the demand bottleneck is to make sure that I target a high value perception market through best quality. Therefore, I can get best prices and sell all my volume to that market instead of having to sell it to the market price. That causes throughput per hectare per 100 millimeter of rain to increase. So the decision to exploit is to have good nutrient flow at my capacity constrained resource. And the way I can exploit more the soil health is to stack more and more production on the same hectares. Cattle, followed by chicken, followed by bees, having pigs on the same hectare, having macadamia trees and cattle on the same hectares. Planning involves now holistic planned grazing. How am I going to graze the next season? What is the design or size the drought reserve? What part of the farm will be a drought reserve? Because I don't know whether it's going to rain or not. And for the demand bottleneck to exploit is to say pre-orders with a due date when I know that what I'm going to have, because I don't know up front. I know it just when I'm close to harvesting. A pre-order from a demand buffer that they have with a due date. And now it's not about availability anymore. It's about reliability and making sure I have reliability, and therefore I can leverage that for better prices as well. The planning is also to utilize all the biomass, because what happens typically is that grass that grow is much more than expected. There's more biomass available than can be. I don't have enough cattle is a problem that some of the farmers end up with. And the planning is to get ready for rain. Make sure that when it rains, it will go into the soil and it won't run off. And do whatever necessary in terms of damming and so on. And the other thing that's happening as part of the exploiting of the capacity constrained resource like cattle and or grains that grow is to adapt genetics to the specific environment where the growth is happening. It's a big group, they call themselves holistic ranching, who as a process of accelerated natural selection to very quickly adapt genetics of cattle to the specific environment. And there are guys in South Africa that's doing, taking ancient grains and planting them and developing that in order to get more effective growth for the grains that is best suited for that environment. The execution here is learn from frequent close observation of what's happening with my soil health. Use chemicals only when indispensable. Do it when it's necessary. Sometimes it is necessary. You can't say, I'm never going to use a herbicide or never use a pesticide. Use it when it's necessary. And in making sure that you never miss a due date in the promise that you've made to your consumer market that I will deliver. But then the beauty of this is the execution is actually done by nature. Nature is doing the heavy lifting. That's, the work is being done by nature. So, this is some of the research results that was reported at the 9th World Congress on Conservation Agriculture that was in South Africa in March. And the research was done between regenerative farmers and conventional farmers right next door. So it's the same environment. 9% more nitrogen, which typically we get from chemical fertilizers, 9% more nitrogen in the regenerative farms. 13% more carbon, 3 times more grassland birds, increased diversity, 33% more insect diversity, 25% more microbes, more than double the rainfall penetration per hour. So it's about not how much rain you get, it's how much rain you keep. 50% more good grazing grasses has been established in 5 years without seeding. They established themselves. 80% more indigenous legumes, and they fix nitrogen very effectively. 60% more grass biomass, and now they've end up with, I don't have enough cattle, and what do I do in order to utilize this capacity that I have? And 60% higher botanical diversity. So more than double the grazing capacity at 3 times the stocking rates. The guys get another farm for free. The challenges where perhaps we can contribute in this TOC world that I've discovered, that exists already. It's not what I did, it's what they are doing. There's a big problem making the transition from conventional to regenerative. And perhaps it's possible that we can provide a generic strategy and tactic tree and say, this is the steps that's reliably you can follow in order to make the transition effectively. The thinking around how to maximize throughput per hectare per 100 millimeter of rain, and I call it holistic throughput thinking, in line with what Justin said. It's, it's not throughput accounting, and he called it throughput decision making. It's what I call it throughput thinking. And it is how do I think for the system as a whole to maximize throughput or on this specific metric. Building the supply chains to consumers directly and get collaboration of the links in the supply chain. And perhaps the model that can be developed there is a model of throughput sharing, where everybody in the link shares the throughput in a fair way, instead of the one selling to the other and trying to maximize a margin. And how to capture the demand. There's lots of demand out there, but how do I capture it for myself? Through understanding better how to do market buffer management. So that's some ideas. If you want to know more, there's lots of stuff on the internet on this. So, questions?
Philip, first, this was a masterclass in presenting. Absolutely beautiful, simple, showed all the complexity in two massive industries. Beautiful, simple solutions. So kudos to you. This is like, I wish every presentation was like this. Just captured everything. Beautifully done. In terms of just going back to your list of challenges, is there anything in terms of how can we best support you? You've kind of have started because you're engaging with these. Is there anything that we can do as a community to help and support in any way?
I don't know. So it's I think individuals want to contribute towards thinking around this. You know, I think perhaps one of the things is to get kind of a specific community going talking about this. You know, there's so that's possibly one of the things, to start a conversation on a WhatsApp group or so on people who are interested to and talking about the challenges they're getting in trying to do something with the farmers in their environment.
And what about putting up events? I'm just thinking, you know, we have mining digital twins that could be configured with scenarios like what you've presented to show the real benefit.
Yeah.
Same with farming, and maybe doing a couple of either webinars or physical live events and stakeholders to come and see.
Yeah. No, 100%. I was also thinking doing a journal program for farmers.
Mm-hmm.
What about getting Philip to the Regen event in Australia? I know the people there.
Yeah. Okay, I'm coming. I'll go. Yes, and Australia is doing a lot of work in regenerative farming. Brazil, by the way, is the most advanced in regenerative farming. 80% of crop farmers are what they call conservation agriculturists, which is an amazing story. Yes.
I know this is fantastic. I got introduced to some of this. If you haven't seen the documentary called The Biggest Little Farm,
yes.
Fantastic introduction to regenerative farming.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you've ever considered expanding what I would call your system to include human health and healthcare costs and the bioavailability of the nutrients in the plants.
Absolutely.
In regenerative farming versus traditional farming.
That's part of the marketing story. You know, that's part of the marketing that needs to be done. By the way, there's a series called Roots So Deep You Can See the Devil Down There, which is a 4-part documentaries that's available that just tells the story of the conventional farmer and the regenerative farmers and the human aspects around that as well.
So thank you, Philip, to refresh that we must save the planet. I follow this guide in India called Sadhguru. He has the leitmotif of save the planet, and he talks about this very thin land range that is very few centimeters.
Yes.
That we need to save it. And if we don't save it, the whole planet will disappear, that people don't believe.
Yeah.
And I think we as TOC must build the real future tree, reality tree, to explain the human people that the planet is going to disappear in a few years. People don't believe about that. And Sadhguru mentioned that this small, you know what I'm talking about, is definitely to save and to preserve. And the other thing I think is a challenge is the huge business of chemical agriculture people they don't want to do the change. They think they're
There's
doing the right
vested
things.
interest.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. Really, really nice. I have one potential argument more for the change. What about groundwater and the consequences to groundwater?
Groundwater, yeah?
Yeah. Because you say that the sponge is keeping the rain.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the pesticides.
But that increases groundwater. That increases the level of groundwater.
I know, but if you stay in the conventional, then the pesticides will follow and they will spoil the groundwater.
Yeah.
But now you keep it, and now you save also partly the groundwater, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So this could be one argument more.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah.